US co-production, and it will be released this coming fall. My testimony is motivated by a deep concern for the Bayaka people and a sense of hope and optimism that with the government of CAR's ratification of ILO 169, the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention, there's an extraordinary and unprecedented opportunity for the Bayaka and other indigenous people in Central Africa to improve their situation. The Bayaka of Sangha are among the last functioning hunter-gatherers on the continent of Africa, indigenous to the Congo Basin, recognized by the ancient Egyptians as the first people of Africa, and named Pygmaeos by the Greeks for their small stature. They're renowned for their profound understanding of the forest, second only in size and importance to the Amazon. As well as being superb naturalists and hunters, I also learned in the process of making the film that they're great storytellers and musicians as well. They play a call and response with the birds and insects of the forest in 5-part harmony, something which is really amazing to witness. Like so many isolated indigenous people, the Bayaka and their nomadic way of life is under siege. Extractive industries such as logging and mining degrade the forest upon which they depend for sustenance. Their land rights are fragile and overlap with other groups, from the timber concessions and their in-migrant loggers to the conservation groups that protect what used to be traditional game for the Bayaka. As their ability to subsist from the forest declines, they become increasingly sedentary in villages where they're economically marginalized and vulnerable to exploitation, where their diet and health has declined. Education, when it did happen, was not useful and is now virtually non-existent. One of the most immediate threats to their livelihood at present is the Bushmeat Trade, which has become organized and international, with poachers coming into the region with heavy weapons. When I first visited the Bayaka in '99, they told me they generally walked half an hour into the forest to set their nets, where they'd be sure to find game like blue duiker, tortoises, porcupine, and so on. Now they report they have to travel deep in the forest for a day or more, and even then they're not guaranteed to find meat. How are the Bayaka, small barefoot men and women, armed with elegant technologies of arrow and spear and net, to compete with marauding poachers with AK-47s? Fortunately, in the area of the Sangha Park and Reserve, the forest still stands, the Bayakas still live, and the nation-state of Central African Republic, one of the 6 poorest countries in the world, had the wisdom and courage to validate the indigenous people living within its borders. First, to sign the UN Indigenous and Tribal People Convention, and then last April to ratify the ILO 169, a binding treaty that covers a wide range of issues, including land rights, access to natural resources, health, education, employment, etc. This treaty's overarching principle is that indigenous and tribal people should be consulted and fully participate in all decision-making processes that concern them. For the Bayaka, there are obvious hurdles to overcome, which have been referred to by previous speakers today. Their non-hierarchical social system, fear of reprisal by Bantu neighbors and local authorities, lack of voice for women, etc. Nonetheless, this treaty has profound opportunities for the Central African government, but the government will need outside support to make it a reality. A committee is being formed now at the highest level of government to draw a roadmap for ILO 169's implementation, but at present there are no funds for it to begin its work. International donors, NGOs, and foundations such as Sacharuna should be prepared to help CAR make these ideas real. Some of our recommendations to this committee are in our written testimony in detail. In the recent past, it was commonly thought by countries such as Central African Republic that indigenous people were an embarrassment to the nation state. But now the world has come to its senses to recognize that diversity of culture, like diversity in nature, does not compromise a nation, but enriches it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I've just been notified I have a vote in the Agriculture Committee, but I have a few minutes here. I have some questions, so if they're quick, that's not, please, just because I'm trying to get as much in as I possibly can here. Let me, Philemon, let me ask you a question. Has any U.S. government official attached to the United States Embassy or otherwise ever visited you in your home community or taken the initiative to reach out directly to you and get involved with you in your indigenous community on issues of mutual interest?
No.
Yeah,
There's not.
and why not? Do we know why not? It just seems to me that that's something, you know, that when I mean the story that you just told, you know, is not unique in some respects to some of the challenges that indigenous communities deal with all over the world, and it would seem to me that if there are human rights issues that are arising, that one of the functions of our embassy should be to send somebody into the community to make sure, to investigate and to help you defend yourself. But they have not. But you're saying that they have not, right?
Yeah, they have not. Only the BBC television was the one who came, and which we really.
I don't think BBC television is on our payroll.
They were the one, of course, we first saw in a place trying to reveal the problem of the community to the international community, because there has been no one there who came in the place. We've been expecting maybe some diplomat to come and see the situation. Right. So the BBC had to shoot the people talking, and then to show to the international communities that, look, the government didn't say anything, and these people are saying like this, and the government is taking talking something different.
But after the BBC highlighted the situation, did any diplomats or anybody come to?
No.
No. Did you reach out at all and ask for any diplomats to come and to see for themselves?
Well, when we were in Ethiopia, you know, we are afraid whether if we approach either to U.S. Embassy in Ethiopia, there might be some problem.
No, I appreciate that fact. It just seems to me that I appreciate your candor, because that's one of the issues that I think we want. You know, it goes back to some of the recommendations that Ms. Adamson made. You know, I mean, highlighting some of this stuff in the country report might compel, you know, a more affirmative response by some of our people on the ground. Thank you very much for that. There's another question, Ms. Adamson. You talked about the example set by Kenya with respect to recognizing indigenous communities and anchoring their rights in the Constitution. How many others are doing that? I mean, Ms. Kerr, you mentioned some of the stuff that's going on, but I mean, is this the beginning of a trend, or do we?
We hope it is.
Yeah.
We hope it is. When we look at the trajectory of indigenous rights across the globe, Africa and Asia have been lagging. And so what's happened within Kenya is a remarkable step forward. There are some countries in South America that have indigenous people mentioned in their constitutions. We have indigenous people mentioned in our constitution. For the continent of Africa, this is an unprecedented step forward.
And let me ask whoever wants to answer this, or you know, you all can answer, I guess, but to the extent that countries like Kenya, you know, recognize indigenous peoples in their constitution, treaties have been signed, agreements have been reached. You know, I have, you know, I've read some pretty incredible constitutions and treaties that say all wonderful things, but then when push comes to shove, they're not implemented. So for those that have, you know, Kenya put it in its constitution, for those countries that have signed treaties and stuff, I mean, are they, you know, we sign treaties in the United States that we don't recognize, that we don't follow. So I'm just curious, are they sign the agreements, or are they then as a follow through there?
I think what we're seeing is that there needs to be assistance, and USAID is in an incredible position to provide democracy-building assistance, because there isn't a normative process to implement what's in place. I wish our other witness, Mary Samant, was a Maasai from Kenya, and she wanted to speak especially to this. She's in visa limbo, and she will be here in the next couple of days, and if you have time,
we'd love to meet her.
Okay, we'll bring her back up to the hill then, because she was very involved in getting the referendum through and representing indigenous peoples in that whole referendum process. And I think she would be able to tell you in more detail, but there is a need for some capacity building around it. most definitely.
Let me ask you a question that has been raised on a number of occasions, and that is, how do we reconcile the rights of indigenous peoples with certain traditional practices, such as female genital mutilation or forced child marriage, which are in clear contradiction with human rights? I mean, we're a Human Rights Commission here, you know, and there comes that kind of confrontation between, you know, recognizing traditional practices, but some of these traditional practices are bad for women, and they're bad for girls, and they're, you know, they're just bad. And so, how do we reconcile those dilemmas?
I'll speak as an indigenous person myself, and in saying that I don't think any society is 100% right in some of their practices and some of the values. And I think that indigenous societies are none less perfect than any other society out there. I think there's a tremendous amount to be learned from indigenous peoples, but perfection probably isn't one of them. And I don't think there's any excuse for not carrying a continual inclusive approach to human rights. And so I think it's a learning process in a lot of this. It's education, it's learning. And what we've seen is indigenous groups coming together, and the ability in that exchange of stories and lessons is extremely powerful. And there would be other indigenous groups that say this is not a good practice. And those kind of dialogues are invaluable. But change is, you know, I mean, and we're not living in a static, we do change as indigenous societies.
And before I yield to my colleague, Congressman Payne, let me just say, I want to say to you what I said to the previous panel, and that is, you know, we want to be, you know, and the recommendations that you gave us, I think, are things that some of them we could follow up on. But we want you to feel free to come to us with some suggestions on how we can be better advocates, and you know, and encourage countries to do the right thing. Obviously, the stuff in Ethiopia is of great concern to us, and we want to work with you on that issue too. But we also want to make sure that our own government, our embassy, is sensitive to some of the human rights challenges, and that when they happen, that, you know, that at least we are raising our voice, saying, you know, this is wrong at a minimum, and to the extent that we can go and investigate firsthand what's happening. I mean, that's what we have human rights officers for, and you know, which would empower our ambassador to go to the head of a country and say, you know, I see this firsthand. So I'm going to leave to go to my Agriculture Committee hearing, but I'm going to yield to Congressman Donald Payne of New Jersey, who probably is the expert on Africa in this Congress, and is an unbelievable champion for human rights. He's on the Foreign Affairs Committee. He is the go-to guy. So I'm sorry to leave you, but you got a smarter guy than me here that's going to take over. So I appreciate very much your testimony, your being here. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for that gracious introduction. And he's a member of Congress, so don't believe a word he says. Let me just say it's certainly a pleasure to be here, and as you can see, we have quite a bit on our plate every day, and I unfortunately, of course, was unable to be here earlier at two other committee hearings that I had before this particular hearing, but I certainly appreciate the testimony from the three witnesses here. I'll get an opportunity to go through it more thoroughly as the day goes on, because I might have some follow-up questions that I would like to be in touch with you about. But I do believe that the question of indigenous people certainly is a very, very important issue. And as you know, there has really, over the course of the years, been a move to attempt to decrease the individual ethnic group's identity. What I mean by that is that I firmly believe that people should continue to be proud of their indigenous heritage, However, by the same token, we find that ethnicity in many parts of developing countries, because in many instances of scarce resources, and if you're going to get ahead, your group has got to be in control, and you therefore distribute the largest of being in control to your ethnic group, which is sort of a downside of the pride in ethnicity. And so there's somehow we've got to, in my opinion, have a balance between the closeness and the heritage of your ethnicity, but also the fact that that should not be the number one issue, and that as we move into a union, a state, a country, that there has to be sharing of all groups, and so we find it seems sometimes incongruous to say, well, how can you say let's be proud and keep the ethnic traditions going, and then on the other hand, you're saying that tends to be a negative because sometimes it's only inclusive. I just wonder if anyone has any comments on that.
Well, I think you raise a really profound issue in this, but I believe multiculturalism is a living reality, and not just for indigenous peoples, but for the globe and whole. We have to learn for our different societies and ethnic groups to get along. One of these learning areas, I believe, and some of these solutions can come out of inclusiveness and practices that engage indigenous peoples in decision making. And I think as we go forward as a planet, we've got to learn to build multicultural democracies. And these are the testing grounds and the ways that we can learn these lessons and begin sharing them. So I agree that, I agree that we have to come together and we have to have a common vision of the future, but I also believe that these differences are going to make us stronger, and making space for these differences is what the lesson needs to be within a greater vision. So I think there's a lot to learn in the African continent around multicultural democracies that could teach all of us, actually, Congressman.
Congressman, in terms of the Bayaka, I think their cultural survival is their physical survival, because in their case, which is very particular because they are really the lowest people on the totem pole, so to speak, they cannot be assimilated in any dignified or mutually enhancing way. So I think that their cultural integrity is survival for them in this regard.
Yeah, we do find that in various countries, in Somalia, for example, they're a group, ethnic group that centuries ago came up from Central Africa, and they have been marginalized from day one. And we found that, as a matter of fact, back about 15 years ago or so, I was able to have our immigration authorities grant the opportunity for them to come to the United States, a large number from Somalia to the U.S., primarily because of the seemingly total difficulty in having that ethnic group assimilated into the Somali culture. And we do find this problem, and of course we've also seen, for example, in Australia, the terrible experiment with the Aborigines, where children were taken from their parents, from their families, and brought into the cities because they just almost abducted, because the authorities in Australia felt that Aborigines, the way they lived, this was not the way that these children should be brought up, although they were doing well, they were content, they had their own culture and society, but these children were simply taken away and brought to so-called civilization, and it was really a tragic experiment for the Aborigines there in Australia. We do find also that there is, and I just might ask you, what do you think that we here in the U.S. Congress could do to assist if you had some real wishes? What is it that you think we could do? I might ask each of you.
My name is Faye Moon. Came from Ethiopia. We do have a number of things I'm just from the minority group, which are really much more marginalized, and they are really to the far east, southern part of Ethiopia. And maybe if anyone happened to be there, maybe you can think like, okay, these people are really still, how comes the governments exist in this country and these people are still living in such a life? And people living in such a life for a long time, and now the government is trying to grab all over what their belongs, the lands, their ancestral land, and they are being displaced at all without even informing, and just bring an investor either from Italy and say, okay, here is take this kind of plot of land and then just do whatever you want to do here without prior consent of the community. So the community were in a dilemma that what's going on, and they couldn't really get anything because the government only talks with its own, the local leaders who are there and finish all the agreement, whatever the kind of agreement they do, and then they now take measures of taking land. And few of us who used to be educated, and we came by chance to school and not really by permission by our parents, we accidentally go somewhere and then get to learn that I should fight for such a kind of people and find the voice or find this problem of these people heard in international community so that they can come and see these people, the situation of these people, and give some pressures to Ethiopian government. And also because the government is benefiting from these people and these people are not benefiting from the government itself. So these people are just remaining there, and the government government of Ethiopia trying to get benefit from the soil of these people, and while they are starving from hunger, and while they are starving from drought, and also the land, the river that they use to cultivate along the Omo River bank during the recession after the overflowing, and then when the river decreases, and then they have to cultivate, and now this river doesn't anymore flows as before, and these people are totally now losing all this, and no response from the government, and the government is bringing all the benefits, some food they call safety net program. I don't know from where, and this program just only for the groups to work for the government, to do what the government want to do there for its own development, and just give people food. If you want to work, we can just give you food instead of providing them with the water pumps that you losing the river. So give you water pump. We want to support you. And I just would like to say something, maybe how could we really, the US Congress could approach the Ethiopian government, and Human Rights Commission also could really dig into this problem and send maybe a mission inside to these communities and see this situation. But I'm talking here, and then, so that you can talk with the Ethiopian government, because we can't talk there in Ethiopia. We can't confront the government. We can't say to the government, this is not good. So we are kind of coming out of Ethiopia and then giving providing the information to the Human Rights and US Congress so that you you become our voice and represent us and go and talk to the Ethiopian government on what is, happening there. Thank you.
Very specifically, Congressman, when Chairman McGovern asked if anyone from the U.S. Embassy had been out to visit Philemon's community, and he'd said no, he'd never heard from any. And we had sort of 3 specific recommendations, and one of them was to actually have the annual State Department human rights reports to include specifically a section that would ask, when appropriate, to have a section on Indigenous peoples' rights in law and practice within each country, and have our embassies maybe do that as a proceeding. The other thing we'd asked was also to look at submitting a request to GAO to audit and report on the human rights status of Indigenous peoples in the countries that receive foreign aid. And the third one was to look at recommending that the Human Rights and International Organizations Subcommittee be assigned the legislative jurisdiction for Indigenous peoples' concerns and issues.
Very good. Well, those, I'm sure that the Commission will accept your recommendations, and we'll have a follow-up for that. We have had discussions in the past regarding the situation in Ethiopia a number of years ago, and we are somewhat familiar with the situation there. However, the U.S., as you know, has very strong relations with Ethiopia. We have several years ago, I had legislation that was critical of the Ethiopian government in regard to the elections of, I guess it was maybe 95 or 97, when 140 people were killed by the military authorities after the elections, when the ruling party of Prime Minister Meles lost the election in Addis, as a matter of fact, and the number of deputies increased from about 3 or 4 to about 90 or 100 from the opposition parties, and there was a tremendous amount of pushback from the Prime Minister. And so we have had a recent report where there supposedly have been improvements in the government's behavior towards indigenous people. But as you know, the big problem that certainly is addressed more so is the problem in the Ogaden, where there has been a tremendous suppression of the Ogaden region that is, of course, primarily Somalis, and the OLF has been trying to, for many years, have been in opposition to the government because of the conditions in the Ogaden. As a matter of fact, I visited a camp in Kenya, the Dadaab camp, where Ogadenese Somali refugees are in this large refugee camp, and had the opportunity to interview some of the refugees who had just come across the border into the camp. So there are certainly problems with the Ethiopian government that we've raised. There's also a law that they passed, which we're trying to look into, that no NGO can receive more than 10% of their funds from outside of the country, which of course weakens many of the NGOs, and so there are, and we're asking an inquiry into that also, to have our embassy question some of these new laws that have been, introduced and passed in Ethiopia. But I think those 3 points are well taken, and we will, I'm sure Ms. McGovern will have a follow-up mechanism for them.
We also, one of our witnesses got hung up in visa limbo, Mary Samat of Maasai, and she'll make it here, but she'll make it a couple days later. So we offered if you want, we'll call your offices and see if you'd like to meet with her. She represents the Kenya 2011.